You're listening to Radio Maria, a Christian voice in your home. We now present our program, Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism, with Roy Showman.
Hi, this is Roy Showman, and welcome again to Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism, the show on Radio Maria that celebrates the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church, or seen the other way around, that celebrates the fulfillment, the completion, the full realization of the promise of Judaism in the Catholic Church and its sacraments. First of all, before I begin today's show proper, my plan for today is to devote the show to another very notable Jewish convert to the Catholic Church named Theodore Ratisbonne. If you have listened to the show in the past, you might have heard me talk about his brother, Alphonse Ratisbonne. I have devoted several shows to Alphonse Ratisbonne. Alphonse Ratisbonne was also a very significant Jewish convert to the Catholic Church, and in fact was the recipient of the only church-approved apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary to this day in the city of Rome itself, the one at San Andrea della Frate. The Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to the then Jewish atheist young man and revealed to him the truths of the faith wordlessly. He fell to his knees weeping, and as soon as he got his voice back, asked to see a priest to be baptized. However, today's show is not about Alphonse Ratisbonne. It's about his elder brother, Theodore Ratisbonne, who had no direct role in Alphonse's conversion, because once Theodore Ratisbonne became Catholic, he was completely cut off from the family and persona non grata, and his younger brother, Alphonse, wanted nothing to do with him and wouldn't even respond to his letters and so forth. So there was no direct influence there, although I'm sure there was a supernatural influence. And when they both became Catholics, and in fact Catholic priests and Catholic religious, they ended up starting a congregation together, the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion, to pray for the conversion of the Jews. Anyway, today I'll be talking about Theodore Ratisbonne. Now, what I will be doing mostly, actually, is reading from his memoirs, because nothing shows the work of grace at work. Nothing shows the hand of God more beautifully and more convincingly than the words of somebody who very gratefully gets called to the Christian faith, to the Catholic faith, through supernatural intervention, which was definitely the case with Theodore Ratisbonne. So before I go to his words themselves, however, I will just date this a little bit, place it in time. Theodore Ratisbonne was born in 1802 to a Jewish family in Alsace, that's northeastern France, to a very wealthy banking family. And he lost his parents while young. His mother died when he was 6. But he was raised by family friends from that point on and destined to join the family business in the bank. And he was in fact apprenticed to a bank when he was 16, with the intention, his family's intention, that would be his career. But he really was bored to tears and hated it. So with that very rough introduction, as I said, he was born in 1802, so we're talking about now when he's 16, around 1820. And now I will go to his memoirs themselves and his words. Let me just say before I do so that I have actually put up his memoirs on my website, salvationisfromthejews.com. So if you would like to read his entire memoirs, which are, of course, far more detailed than what I'll be reading on the air, they're about 80 or 90 pages. And, of course, I'll be reading probably, an extract that consists of 8 or 10 pages of it. So if you want to read his entire memoirs, they're available for free in PDF form on my website, salvationisfromthejews.com. Anyway, he now finds himself at 16 as an apprentice in the banking house. Turning to his memoirs, in these dispositions, I entered the Fould Banking Company, then one of the leading banking houses in Paris. However, as I said, he was bored to tears and detested banking. Back to his words, During these dark months, I became dreamy, romantic, and almost poetical. I enjoyed the country more than Paris. I often went to the countryside where the family had a magnificent castle, and I found my greatest happiness walking along the paths of the park, where I shed tears on hearing the song of the birds and the vibrant echo of the winds in the trees. How happy I would have been at this time if I had some religion. But I knew of no person and no book who could teach me about divine truths. In any case, I would have disdainfully turned from anyone who mentioned Christianity to me, since, prejudiced as I was, I thought of it as idolatry. As for modern Judaism, I was disgusted with it and ashamed of it, and the synagogue was a barrier between God and me. Nevertheless, I decided to take a tutor in religion. A young modern rabbi came once or twice a week to teach me to pray in Hebrew, and he explained, indifferently well, the meaning of the Jewish feasts and ceremonies. These lessons did not arouse the slightest interest in me. However, I do remember one day when we were discussing the promise of the Messiah, I said to the rabbi, "When will this promise be realized?" He shrugged his shoulders. I continued, "Christians believe that the Messiah has already come. Could they be right?" He made a sign of denial. As I insisted, he said angrily, "If you want to believe it, I cannot stop you." Needless to say, these lessons made absolutely no impression on me, except that, as a matter of conscience, every day I read long Hebrew prayers for my mother. This meaningless life occupied several years. It is impossible to express my sadness and interior emptiness. They were eating me up. Something mysterious was going on in my soul. I lived without any religion, and I sought neither good nor evil, but I often said, "I am 20 years old, and I do not know why I exist. What is the purpose of my life on earth? What is at the end of the road? What is my business here? What direction should I take?" These questions gave rise to numerous others and the wildest conjectures, and they soon became an obsession with me to the point where I could think of nothing else. It seemed to me unreasonable that such interesting questions should go unanswered. I felt vaguely that there was some hidden mystery behind them. I believed that somewhere in the world there must be a school, a temple, where the secret of present and future life would be revealed to a small number of chosen people. I had heard about the secrets of Freemasonry. I became a postulant. In all good faith, I eagerly asked for admittance. But there was no answer to my questions, to my desire for knowledge. At the time, I read Rousseau, and I swallowed indiscriminately every opinion, every contradiction of this charismatic teacher. I became more and more austere and even eccentric in my way of acting. I thought I would find the answer to my doubts in philosophy, and I began to read with insatiable hunger the chief works then popular. I read Rousseau, Voltaire, Volney, Bolingbroke, and everything produced in the 18th century, both the attractive and the terrible. These are sad memories for me. The last vestiges of the traditional faith to which I had stubbornly clung withered with these readings. How far away I was then from the path to which Providence was leading me without any awareness on my part. The search for truth completely possessed me, and I was always hopeful of finding answers from the philosophers. But the emptiness and sadness of soul were also haunting me without respite. I had a single desire, to know the purpose of my existence. I had not the slightest inkling of what this purpose might be, and my only guides were my own unaided reason and a melancholy imagination. I pondered a great deal during my solitary walks, which often went far into the night. More than once I was still up at daybreak, awaiting sunrise after a whole night spent asking questions of nature which remained silent, of the stars which said nothing to me, and of the mystery of darkness. I became tired of myself and of my theories. After thinking so much about good and evil, about God's power and lack of power, and about the problem of life, I finally rebelled against the whole idea of a divinity. I could not believe in a deaf and silent God. I was crushed by the contradictions of life, and the whole world appeared ridiculous to me. Sometimes I sulked with Rousseau, sometimes I laughed with Voltaire. This latter was Satan's laughter. One night I spent the whole time in the garden looking at the stars. After a long time I was amazed that I could ever have thought that such magnificence could be self-created. At the sight of their hosts above my head, I knew that an intelligent power must have formed them and must be directing their harmonious being. This thought came to my mind without, however, convincing me. At that moment, so full of suffering, I uttered this cry from an embittered heart. O God, if you really exist, show me the truth, and I promise at this moment that I will devote my life to searching for it. I was pierced with cold. To get warmed up, I went to sit on a dung heap in the garden, and this was an exact symbol of my interior state. So I've been reading from the memoirs of Theodore Ratisbonne, a Jewish young man of the early 19th century who became a Catholic priest. And I just want to stop and make a few comments on the passages I just read. One is that the storyline or the course of events here is extremely common for the recipients of essentially miraculous conversion to Catholicism, the truths of the Catholic faith being miraculously revealed to them. It's very similar to the story of Charlie Rich, which I have also given on the air a few times. He was in the 20th century, but he too was, I could say, he had lost his Jewish faith. He was obsessed with the search for the meaning of life, the search for the ultimate truths. And he read all of the philosophers he could find in the New York Public Library system to find the answer to the question about the meaning of life. And when he couldn't find the answer in the philosophers, he despaired. That's exactly the same storyline, so to speak, as Theodore Ratisbonne here. Also, there is a wonderful Catholic saint, Charles de Foucauld, who's genuinely a saint in the sense that he's canonized. I'm pretty sure he's canonized. He might only be beatified, but I believe he's canonized. And he was also early 20th century. And his prayer, he was an atheist. He was a completely non-practicing, atheistic Catholic. But he also, at one point, called out in his despair, God, if you exist, I have to know. And that was enough for God to reveal himself to him in the fullness of the truths of the Catholic faith, and therefore he too became a priest. And finally, another Jewish convert who's in my book, Honey from the Rock, Rhonda Chervin. She also was a young Jewish atheist, but again in despair at the meaninglessness of life. And at one point she cried out to God, God, if you exist, save my soul, if I have a soul. And that was enough for Jesus to reveal himself to her. So he really is the Good Shepherd. He really is our Lord and Master and Savior and God and Creator knocking on the door of our hearts. You all know the image that's very often beautifully portrayed in paintings or in stained glass windows of Jesus standing at the outside of a door, knocking gently. And that is really the truth. And he is as close to us as our own breath, and he is listening for the faintest invitation to call him in. And in the case of people with no faith at all, very often that invitation, the invitation is sufficient if it is simply, I have to know the meaning of life. God, if you exist, I have to know. So we should never despair at friends and relatives, perhaps children who don't have faith. We should continue to pray for them, and we should certainly encourage their goodwill in asking the question, their goodwill in wanting to know the meaning of life, wanting to know whether the story about God is true, whether there is a God, wanting to know whether Christianity is true. In other words, if they earnestly ask the question, that's enough. Obviously it's nice to encourage them to accept the truth, but encouraging them simply to ask the question is in itself, it should be enough. It allows God to do the rest. So with that, I will go back to the words of Theodore Ratisbonne, but not before saying very briefly that one of the reasons that I'm reading this and that I enjoy reading it so much is that, again, there are a lot of parallels with the circumstances of my own conversion, the role of walking in nature, and simply finding the solace in the beauty and peace of nature that I couldn't find in the exercise of my life itself. And as Ratisbonne looked up at the starry sky and knew that God must exist, the first revelation, so to speak, that I received that God must exist was looking at the mountains. I was high in the Austrian Alps, and it was sunset, and I was above the tree line, and I just looked out at the snow-covered mountains, spread out as far as the eye could see in the sunset light. So the sky was pale pink, and the snow was pale blue, and I just knew that God must exist. As Ratisbonne said, I was amazed that I could ever have thought that such magnificence could be self-created. At the sight, I knew that an intelligent power must have formed them and must be directing their harmonious being. So anyway, back to Ratisbonne himself. Despite this experience, it did not immediately change his life. He went back to his confusion and his despair. He considered marrying. Everybody was encouraging him to marry. He was now in his early 20s, and he was introduced to some very attractive possible spouses, and he managed to resist the temptation, although he was kind of shuttling between his philosophical despair and flirtation with the attractions of the world. And in that state, he felt an interior imperative that he leave Paris, probably where the temptations were so strong, and return to Alsace, to Strasbourg, where he came from. So back to his words, I left for Strasbourg very confused and uneasy, but Providence was about to direct my life more visibly than ever before. Suffering and misunderstanding had made me more flexible. I was in the desperate position of a drowning man who, having fought against the waves until exhaustion, finally abandons himself to the current. Only in my case, I no longer had the strength to resist the kind hand stretched out to snatch me from death. That kind hand, of course, would prove to be the hand of Jesus. Back to Ratisbonne. Always hungry to learn, I still found nothing which satisfied my need to know, and I was becoming resigned to living out my life in ignorance when one day at the end of the year, I was accosted in one of the law faculty classrooms. At this point, he was studying law, by a young man whom I had never seen before, who suggested that I follow a special course in philosophy to be given by Mr. Bautin. I immediately accepted the suggestion which he made, for I always looked upon philosophy as the only way to knowledge and truth. As for religion, it had not left the slightest trace in my free-thinking mind. I had a profound distaste for Judaism, as for all other religions whose names I knew. In 1823, we began the special philosophy course given by Mr. Bautin. There were only 4 of us at this first course, an Irish Catholic, a schismatic Russian, and 2 Jews. His teaching was unlike any other. It overflowed from a deeply entrenched faith. We listened to him with emotion and admiration as he developed the doctrine which initiated us into the mysteries of man and nature. Until this time, I had knocked in vain at the doors of schools of humanity to ask the reasons of things, the goal of life, the cause of the mysteries which surround us. Everywhere I had found only hypotheses, contradictions, and deceptions. This Christian professor found in my mind a clean slate. The conviction of his interesting and brilliant lectures drove away, without any resistance on my part, the darkness which my indiscriminate reading had accumulated in my mind. Not only did the lectures enlighten my intelligence, but they filled my soul with warmth, joy, and peace. The scales fell from my eyes, and I caught a glimpse of the light of truth. I saw man as he is and as he is meant to be. I understood that man is no longer as he was when he came from the hands of God. On the one hand, psychology shows us the admirable scope, the harmony, the order of importance of human faculties. However, the reality of history shows us that a profound alteration has taken place in these faculties. Man's moral degradation is an indisputable fact, and I was no longer surprised to find areas of darkness within myself and around me. But how can one explain this general decadence except through an initial fall? The idea of reparation through sacrifice and other truths of religion flowed naturally and logically from this doctrine. Now I'll interrupt myself for a moment and say that this to me is one of the tragedies of the failure, the too common, not universal, but too common failure for Catholics to evangelize their non-Catholic friends, and to tell the truth, to evangelize their Catholic friends and relatives too, who don't take the religion seriously. Because when I was a young Jewish man in my 20s and in my early 30s, I was dying to know the answers to just these questions. I used to say to myself, it's not fair. Life should have an owner's manual. You buy a car, it has an owner's manual that tells you about the car and what you should do to keep it in good shape and what its purpose is and so forth. How come we don't come with an owner's manual? The truth is we do come with an owner's manual. And the teaching of the Catholic Church, and even or especially the teaching of the Penny Catechism, of the Baltimore Catechism, I think the first question in there, I don't remember literally, you'll have to forgive me, but is along the lines of who is God and why did he make us and what is the purpose of our lives and so forth. And it lays it out in language that a 7-year-old can understand. The true and straightforward and simple and mutually consistent and complete answers to all of these questions which were tormenting this 22-year-old brilliant young Jewish man, I'm talking now about Ratisbonne, as well as tormenting me. I mean, the answers could not be laid out more plainly, more simply, more coherently, more convincingly than they are in the most simple, basic teachings of the Catholic faith. And yet, tragically, many Catholics don't take them seriously. And also tragically, by and large, anyone who's a non-Catholic hasn't even been exposed to them, don't even know that they're there. And the truth of them brings its own conviction in the sense of convincing, as they did for Ratisbonne. The clarity and logic and consistency and fullness of the answers were enough to convict them of their truth. Anyway, probably enough said, but it's also very interesting and very beautiful that it's the state of the fall of man, the tension between the desire to do good, or our natural inclination to good, and our natural inclination in the fallen state to depravity, which is one of the great mysteries of our existence. Before my conversion, I was a rather fanatic Bob Dylan fan, and I remember reading some of his poetry where the young Bob Dylan was agonizing over where do these destructive impulses within him come from? Why? He tells a story of passing by somebody who's standing on a building threatening to jump, and a part of him is wishing to see him jump. And Dylan asks himself, what's going on? Where does this come from? Why can I think of myself as a good person and still have this impulse kind of wishing to see him jump? I remember being exposed to that poem of Dylan as a college student, and it always haunted me. The answers to that they're all found in the basic doctrine of the Catholic Church, and in this case, in the discussion of the original state of man when he was created, original sin, concupiscence, the whispering of the enemy of our salvation in our ear, and so forth. All of the questions which torment the human soul have their answers given in essentially the Penny Catechism of the Catholic Church, and it's hardly triumphalism or the exercise of a sense of superiority to want to share that. We're all familiar with the corporal acts of mercy and with the spiritual acts of mercy, perhaps less familiar with the spiritual acts of mercy than with the corporal acts of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and so forth, housing the homeless. But among the spiritual acts of mercy are instructing the ignorant and reproving the sinner. And anything that is the benefit of which is for our eternal salvation is infinitely more valuable than anything the benefit of which is for our temporal comfort. So, they're both absolutely necessary, but it's inexcusable that the spiritual acts of mercy should be, put aside and ignored in favor of the corporal acts of mercy. One could say they're equally important, but if one were forced to determine which ones were more important, it would seem to me that the argument would be that the spiritual acts of mercy must be more important because they affect our eternity. They affect how we're not going to be, spending the next 80 years, but how we're going to be spending the next 800 million years plus. And of course, anything we do that helps somebody else have an extremely pleasant 800 million years plus is infinitely more important than anything we do that helps them have a pleasant 80 years. So back to Theodore Ratisbonne. He's describing now his the philosophy that he was learning from this Christian philosophy professor. This was Christianity in its most ideal form, without any theological formulas. Without being aware of it, my soul was being nourished on Christian teaching, and I did not know that under the guise of this enlightening philosophy which gave me such joy, religion was to be found. Without any consciousness on my part, I was enveloped and penetrated by this divine light. I think I would have never had the courage to come face to face with Christianity. I had to some extent become a Christian without knowing it. I had found the way to the truth which I had sought so much and on which I had called so often, and I finally caught a glimpse of the goal of my life to which all my desires and thoughts were directed. This superior goal was no longer a mystery to me. It seemed as attainable as light is to a man who is willing to open his eyes, and I could not understand the thoughtlessness of those who accept this truth and yet take part in the amusements of the children of the world, forgetting that life on earth is a passing thing, a roadway which leads to a sublime end. But how shall I explain the struggles which I had to face with my childhood prejudices, my memories, my instinctive attachment to the thing I called the religion of my fathers? I was not sufficiently educated to see the link between Judaism and Christianity. I thought they were two different religions and that the God of Abraham was not the God of Christians. I was afraid of studying this question at a deeper level, and yet I had a profound belief in the Blessed Trinity without knowing the theological formula for this sacred dogma. Now, I'm going to pause now. I've been reading the memoirs of Theodore Ratisbonne, an extremely notable Jewish convert to the Catholic faith, later a priest and the founder of the Congregation of the Sisters of Zion. The Congregation of Our Lady of Zion. And I've been reading his memoirs. I'm going to stop now. We're about halfway through the show. I usually stop about halfway through the show. We'll have a short musical break. Again, this is a live call-in show, so if you wish to call in during the break, that's a very good time to do so, because then I can take the calls coming out of the break. The number here is 866-333-6279 or 866-333-MARY. Again, that's 866-333-6279. You're listening to Radio Maria. The website, by the way, is radiomaria.us. Last week was the Mariathon, a fundraising drive. And so I wish to just remind our listeners that they may want to keep in mind the possibility of going to the website and supporting the station and supporting the ministry of this radio ministry of Radio Maria to be a Christian voice in your home. And with that, let's go to the break. We'll be back in a few moments, continuing with the story of Theodore Ratisbonne and your calls if any come in. Be back in a few minutes.
You're listening to Radio Maria, a Christian voice in your home. We now return to our program, Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism, with Roy Showman.
Hi, this is Roy Showman. Welcome back to Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism. And I have been talking today about Theodore Ratisbonne, a very impressive Jewish convert to Catholicism of the first half of the 19th century. And I've been reading from his memoirs. But until and unless we get calls, I will continue with the memoirs of Theodore Ratisbonne. Now, I had just come to the point where he was studying philosophy under a Christian professor, and the truths of the Catholic faith, although not presented in the context of being Catholicism, but simply presented in their abstract form, had convicted him of essentially the truth of Christianity. And I will actually pick up a couple of sentences, I'll repeat a couple of sentences at the end of what I said before the break, and then go on. So he had come to see the truth of Christianity, but he was still struggling against that. And then going to his words, I was not sufficiently educated to see the link between Judaism and Christianity. I thought they were two different religions, and that the God of Abraham was not the God of Christians. I was afraid of studying this question at a deeper level, and yet I had a profound belief in the Blessed Trinity without knowing the theological formula for this sacred dogma. This ideal was revealed to me in a single phrase: God is love. The evangelical word gave warmth to my heart and light to my mind. It seemed to me to contain the key to knowledge. In the love of God, I saw a foreshadowing of the mystery of the Trinity, the mystery of creation, and the reason for all the acts of our redemption. Eternal love, being love by his very nature and substance, begot eternal love. What could he have loved before he created beings? Obviously, he loved himself. This means that divinity consisted of a lover and a loved one. But between these two objects, there was a continual flow of life, of communication, and of love, which constitutes the third term and which completes, as it were, the perfect accord. These vague and imperfect ideas satisfied my thirst for knowledge, and I was glad to see that Christians did not adore three gods, the chief question that keeps Jews from Christianity. The creation of man and of the firmament also became comprehensible to me. An all-powerful love would of necessity have grandiose plans, and it is easy to understand that he would create many beings to make them happy. Well, since we are in the period of the first novena, calling down the Holy Spirit, the period between the Ascension and Pentecost, I am going to reread these few sentences in which this young Jewish man, not overtly exposed to Christianity, came into this incredibly deep understanding of the most holy Trinity. So I will just read the few sentences I read, because I can't imagine a more compelling explanation, actually, of the most holy Trinity. This ideal was revealed to me in a single phrase: God is love. This evangelical word gave warmth to my heart and light to my mind. It seemed to me to contain the key to knowledge. In the love of God, I saw a foreshadowing of the mystery of the Trinity, the mystery of creation, and the reason for all the acts of our redemption. Eternal love, being love by his very nature and substance, begot eternal love. What could he have loved before he created beings? Obviously, he loved himself. This means that divinity consisted of a lover and a loved one. But between these two objects, there was a continual flow of life, of communication, and of love, which constitutes the third term and which completes, as it were, the perfect accord. These vague and imperfect ideas satisfied my thirst for knowledge, and I was glad to see that Christians did not adore three gods, the chief question that keeps Jews from Christianity. Now I will continue with the words of Theodore Ratisbonne. All the acts of redemption, all the mysteries of religion, follow logically from these primary truths. If some parts of this luminous picture were still hidden from me, I did not add to the darkness by objecting presumptuously. I had had too much experience with the weakness of my own reasoning to take pleasure in useless discussions. I was satisfied with the little knowledge I had acquired, and I hoped that future studies would in time fill the empty spaces. It is strange that I already had a strong faith in Jesus Christ, and yet I could not bring myself to invoke him, nor even to say his name. So entrenched was my inherited Jewish hatred for his holy name. An unusual event put my faith to the test. I had fallen ill in a Swiss hotel, and my vivid imagination, full of unreasonable presentiments, made me believe that I was going to die. I fell into depression, and at that decisive moment I did not know what God to call upon. The vagueness of my philosophical beliefs left me a prey to terrible uncertainty, and within me there was an immense struggle between my childhood prejudices and my new faith. I dared not pray for fear of offending the God of Abraham by praying to the God of the Christians. It was a fierce battle, but grace won the day. From my lips and my heart, the name of Jesus Christ came as a cry of distress. It was evening, and the following day I was so much better that I was able to leave Geneva, where I was just passing through. I was so comforted by my invocation of Jesus Christ that I wanted to continue praying. To provide nourishment for my hungry soul, I asked one of the hotel maids to buy me a prayer book. She did, but looking more closely at the book, I discovered it was by a Protestant minister named Oswald. That was enough to keep me from reading anymore, for I had always had an instinctive aversion to Protestantism. I could not recognize Christianity under the guise of Protestantism. My mind needed specific doctrines, and I had no desire to return to the discussions and controversies in which I had wandered until now. I began to pray quite simply, straight from my heart, without the help of any book or any human formula. My lips became accustomed to the name of Jesus Christ. I pronounced it confidently, and I also prayed to Mary. The idolatrous passion which I had experienced in my youth had left in my soul an unconquerable need to know. The name of Jesus fulfilled this need and gave me a hint of the greatness of God's love. On the other hand, the undying memory of my mother's tenderness gave me an intuition of Mary's love. I could not separate the names of Jesus and Mary. They represented to me all the sweetness and sympathy to be found in heaven and on earth. I loved them inexpressibly. Alas, this springtime fervor lasted much too short a time. Yet I took an ever-growing delight in the teachings of Christianity. I had been completely won over to the faith, but I was not baptized. I had no part in the grace of the sacraments. Mr. Boutin, that was the philosophy professor, did not put me in contact with any priest. I had no direction, and I did not know how to go about getting baptized. Providence had placed me in an unusual situation which required prudent, careful conduct. Well, I will go on with these memoirs of Theodore Ratisbonne. I'm just going to stop to take a breath, to just point out how unspeakably beautiful this is, and how beautiful the not only the awakening of faith in Ratisbonne was, but the faith itself. I mean, of course, I wish I was born into the Catholic faith. Of course, I wish I had the infinite gift of the knowledge of the Catholic faith and the sacraments of the Catholic faith, you know, from birth and from childhood, and wasn't halfway through life almost before I came to them. But there's one thing I am infinitely grateful for having not been born and raised Catholic, and that is the one disadvantage of being born and raised Catholic is not noticing what you have in the Catholic faith, and not noticing, in particular, in the context of this reading, the infinite gift of having the doctrine of Christianity and the doctrine of Catholicism and the answers to all of the questions that torment the human soul laid out there in black and white. And it's beautiful to see how Ratisbonne's conversion to a large extent came about simply by being exposed to and absorbing the truth of the Catholic faith, just seeing them, just being told them, and understanding viscerally how perfectly they gave the answer to everything that was tormenting his heart, and how perfectly they fit together. And that appreciation of seeing what is there for all of us in the doctrine of the Church is easier. It's easier to see coming from outside. It's easier to see coming from a blank slate, coming from ignorance and desperation and desire to have the answers than it might be coming from having heard it with half an ear, so to speak, all of one's life, and kind of becoming somewhat deafened to it, or becoming inured to it, or callous to it, just because you have been exposed to it all your life. So that's another reason why I think it's salutary to read the accounts of converts to Catholicism, because seeing the faith anew, seeing the faith fresh, as it's seen through the eyes of someone who's coming to the faith for the first time, can remind us of, in fact, what we've always had. And I did not go into that discussion in order to plug my book, but I have made that discussion, so I will plug one of my books, Honey from the Rock, 16 Jews Find the Sweetness of Christ, which is a collection of Jewish to Catholic witness testimonies that do exactly that. So anyway, back to Ratisbonne. Unfortunately, we're coming near the end of the show, so I might have to continue with Theodore Ratisbonne next week. But now he's going to go into a discussion of what his situation was, because he was still Jewish. He was still in the heart of a Jewish family. He was, in fact, very involved in teaching and directing a school for Jewish children, a Jewish school for Jewish children, and yet he found himself totally convinced of the truths of the Catholic Church and totally in love with Jesus and Mary. So back to at this point, his description in his memoirs of this situation. No one in either my family or outside suspected my leanings to Christianity. But my Christian faith was growing more and more, and I felt the need of participating in the worship of a living religion. I deplored the limitations of a situation which prevented me from declaring my Christian faith. You have no idea of the thrill of joy which went through me when I secretly assisted at a church feast. I shall never forget my feelings when for the first time I assisted at a high mass, when I heard the singing echoing religiously in my soul like prayer and love, when I raised my timid eyes from the back of the church where I had hidden myself to see the white-clad priest raise the host to expose the Blessed Sacrament. His white head was enveloped in clouds of incense, and he seemed to me to be clothed in fire. I did not know where he had come from, nor how he remained in the air. I thought that he was borne up on the cloud of incense. I looked upon him as almost a celestial creature. This was a new experience for me. I had seen Catholic worship in all its pomp. All my ideas about the Temple of Jerusalem and the sacrifices that were offered there came back to my mind. Strange thoughts occurred to me. It seemed to me that the world outside was just a temple of idols surrounded with fear and darkness. The church alone seemed to me to be the sole home of those who adored the true God. Thus I went from one enlightening experience to another, and each of my aspirations found an echo and an answer in some point of Christian doctrine. My reason was nourished by the works of Bossuet, and in the depths of my soul I found inexpressible delight in the life-giving word of the gospel. I was eager to read these holy pages, but I made the resolution not to touch the Gospels until I had read the complete Old Testament. I remember these days so well. It was 9 o'clock in the evening when I read the last lines of the Old Testament and immediately opened the New Testament to read at least one chapter. I was so attracted by it that I spent part of the night reading it. In fact, I did not put it down until I had read the whole of St. Matthew. The same thing happened when I began St. John's Gospel, and twice later. I could not put it down until I had read it through. So now then I'm obviously compressing the testimony in the interest of time. So his conviction of Christianity is obviously all one could hope for. He has not yet formally entered the sacramental life of the church. He has not yet told his family, and he is still wrestling with the idea of marriage, which in his Jewish context was, very much expected of him. He was at that stage in life, and he was quite a catch, so to speak, and a number of attractive matches were being continually proposed to him. So now I will go to a little bit discussion of that. It was suggested that I marry a young lady from Vienna whose name, fortune, and qualities completely dazzled me. Every day pressure was brought to bear on me to assure me that this step would provide me with all the happiness I could wish for. But some mysterious power within me counterbalanced my family's insistence and my own desires. I became ill from the struggle. I lost my taste for prayer and for serious work. More melancholy and dreamy than ever before, I was continuously attracted by the prospects offered by this marriage, and yet I could not bring myself to make a decision. It was as though I were immobilized by an invisible power. All the members of my family, all my friends reproached me for my inexplicable vacillation. I consulted Mr. Bautin, the philosophy professor, but out of respect for my liberty, he refused to bring any influence to bear on me. And when I asked him for help in deciding my future, he answered with an indifferent smile, "If you marry, you do well. If you do not marry, you do better." And he left me to my indecision. Sometimes I wanted to do well, sometimes I wanted to do better, and for 3 long months I battled in the midst of the most cruel perplexity. That was reading from the Memoirs of Theodore Ratisbonne. I have come, unfortunately, to the end of our time together today, so I will leave this as a bit of a cliffhanger to be perhaps continued on next week's show, the continuation of his memoirs. But I think, as you know from the introduction to the show, you know how the battle ends, you know how the story ends. He was saved from making the irreversible move of getting married, and his conversion reached its fulfillment, or I shouldn't say fulfillment because it's never fulfilled or completed, but reached its next fuller stage when he became sacramentally a member of the Catholic Church, was baptized, received First Holy Communion, and very soon thereafter felt the calling to become a priest, and as I said, ended up starting a religious congregation in the Holy Land, the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion, to pray for the conversion of the Jews. And he also ran schools for Jewish children and for Christian children, and anyway, I'll leave that for the continuation of the discussion of Theodore Ratisbonne. But thank you for having joined us today. Let us throw up a silent prayer, a short prayer to Theodore Ratisbonne, that the joy and the fulfillment that he found in the Catholic Church and the truths of the Catholic Church may be shared by all of us with the full joy, with the full realization, with the full certitude, with the sursum corda, with the elation of heart, which he found when he entered the Church, that it may be shared by all those we love, all of our family members, all of our friends, whether they are cradle Catholics or non-Christians or Jews or whatever, that they may come into the fullness of joy and certainty and peace that Theodore Ratisbonne came to through his entry into the Catholic Church. And with that, again, thank you for joining me this week. You've been listening to Roy Schoeman on Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria. And I invite you to join us again next week, same time, same place. Bye for now.